Yeah, this is my 28th year.
Oh. Sorry,
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yep. This is my 28th year in East Auckland. And one of the things I would like to do in this hour with you is to ask each of you about your tenure here in Howicks, Pakuranga, Botany in the area, and particularly the things that you appreciate about being here in this greater area of Howicks. So we'll come to that in a moment, but Lee's asked me to share about the Howicks 175th anniversary year, which is this 2022. So by way of brief introduction, and then we can pause and have some questions along the way. The beginnings of European settlement in Howicks were November 1847. In fact, the 15th of November 1847, when the Fencible retired soldiers, wives and children arrived on Howicks Beach, and it was a major migration scheme to New Zealand. And so this is what we're remembering, this beginning of settlement. Now, I also need to sort of say, because people often ask, the history before the 1840s with Maori, with tangata whenua, people of the land, with Ngaitai, which is the tribal affiliation in our area, goes back, of course, several hundred years. The Maori people developed their own culture from a Pacifica Polynesian background, arriving in Aotearoa about the 13th century. And in fact, I often say to migrant people that New Zealand is one of the last landmass areas in the world where a human footprint appeared. So humans here from about the 13th century. And we were virtually the last area, other than Antarctica, of course, where that occurred. So Australia has a very ancient human history in Africa and Southeast Asia and other parts of the world. So we're relatively fresh, aren't we? And so the Treaty of Waitangi, signed in February 1840, that partnership between the British Crown and Maori really enabled legitimate and proper migration. And so the Fencible Scheme, the Royal New Zealand Fencible Corps, was set up as a scheme by which people could come here to the Auckland area, and retired soldiers who'd served in the British Army or the Royal Marines. And the idea was for a number of settlements around sort of South Auckland that could also act as protection if there was some turmoil, particularly with Maori. So you need to sort of out this issue that the Fencibles came because it was unclear as to how everyone was sort of behaving themselves. So the first group of Fencibles came. Now, Fencible also comes from the Scottish word defensible. And as I say, these guys were mainly in their 40s. They'd served in the army or the Marines, and most of them were married with families. So about 2,463 was the total number of the Fencible migration. And they arrived from November 1847 on Howicks Beach. The settlements were set up in Howicks, in Panmure, Otahuhu, and Onehunga. And the largest of the settlements was at Howicks. So 2,463, it was considered a large migration project for the very early days of New Zealand. And interestingly enough, the settler population of Greater Auckland in the late 1840s, in fact in 1848, was 2,813 people.
Ooh.
So the migration folks, the Fencible folks first came in 1847. There were several waves through to 1854, but in effect, the Fencible families almost doubled the population of Auckland, settler population of Auckland. It's an interesting fact, isn't it? And this 2,463, it's broken down to be 702 Fencibles, the retired soldiers, 547 wives, 1,214 children, 2,463. This was a scheme of migration to New Zealand, as I say, from 1847 to 1854, that was earlier than the first people settling in Canterbury, in Christchurch, or Otago, and only a few years after the first mainly European settlement in New Plymouth and Nelson. So the significance of the Fencibles coming to Howick is not just of interest to us who live here in East Auckland, it actually has national interest because it's considered to have been a successful migration group who came at 2,463, and that helped set up Howick as we know. The Alan LaRoche, the Howick historian, and I want to acknowledge his very significant work. Of all parts of New Zealand, there are very few places where an amateur historian, that's in fact not a university sort of professor or somebody, but an historian of Alan's caliber has arisen and telling the story of the Fencible migration and being very instrumental in the Howick Historical Village as well. So we really honour and can be very grateful to Alan LaRoche for his publications, and some of you might be familiar with them, that tell the story in much greater depth than that simple overview I've given. So here's one of the books. This was published in the early 1990s, History of Howick Pakuranga, and also Whitford, Bucklands, Eastern Beaches and surrounding districts. But more importantly, his major work that is just a few years ago, Grey's Folly. And that's why the title comes from the fact that Governor Grey selected the site of Howick, and it was considered by many as being way out from Auckland, and it was a bit of a folly. So a history of Howick, Pakuranga, Bucklands and Eastern Beaches, East Tamaki, Whitford, Beachlands and Maraita. And there's the main street of Howick in about 1910. Now, this book is available at local bookstores, especially Poppy's in Howick and Paper Plus, or you can get it from the library. And I'd really encourage you in this 175th year since those first Fencible folks came to read this magnificent publication, which describes in detail how people were recruited in the UK, the voyage out. For example, the first two ships that came were the Sir Robert Sale and the Minerva. They took about 4.5 months in a direct voyage. They didn't stop anywhere, direct from the UK to New Zealand. And along the way, a number of people died. For example, on the Sir Robert Sale, one Fencible soldier died, 8 children, 2 women, and there were 5 births. And on some of the ships, remember over several years, 1847 to 1854, even more deaths on the voyage. So this was serious stuff, and different to some of you who might be migrants who have flown to New Zealand in 24 hours. It was a different process in the late 1840s, taking 4.5 months with everyone crammed into a sailing ship to be here. A few other points I wanted to make is that when the first group was arriving on the beach there at Howick on the 15th of November 1847, they were welcomed by local Maori. So there was an acceptance, a welcome, and Maori helped with the construction of some of the local whareas and cottages, as well as supplying food. So that's been very helpful to us in our Howick 175 committee, as we've consulted with NITI, the NITI Trust Board, and worked out things that we want to do together. And you can see their NITI website, which also gives much of their history, which is so important. So that's a little bit of the introduction to the 1847-2022 year. Some people have said to me, why, Richard, do 175th year? Why not wait till the 200th anniversary in 2047? And the simple answer to that is quite a number of us may not be here in 2047.
Yeah.
And talking about Alan LaRoche, who's now in his 80s, Moran Cooper, who was the last Howick mayor, also in his 80s. This 175th year is a great opportunity for us to honour our elders and people who have given so much to the community of Howick and districts here in East Auckland. So we didn't want to miss the opportunity of the 175th year of actually doing something to celebrate our history, but equally so to celebrate the diversity of our people today. So Howick, Pakuranga, Botany, Flatbush is a very diverse community, as many of you well know. In fact, the Botany political electorate has the highest number of adults born outside of New Zealand than any other political electorate in New Zealand. So we have, about 45 to 55% of our peoples, our adults, having come and moved here from other countries. So it's very important that we give opportunity to various groups, whether they be Asian, Pacifica, South African, or whatever, to understand the history of our area, and especially in our schools, to know something about our East Auckland history. Lee, I've spoken for quite a bit there. I could go on a little bit further. I'm just wondering whether I pause and there's some initial sort of questions. What would be good?
Yep. Now, folk, are there any questions that you want to ask Richard? Just remember to unmute yourself. I'll leave it open for questions.
They didn't settle down on the beach. Did they immediately move up to where the main street is now, or did they first start settling down at the beach waterfront there?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Yes, the arrival was obviously, on the beach from the boats, but the cottages, with part of the agreement for the Fencibles to come, and as I say, Howick was the largest settlement. They pretty much settled up around where the main street is today in Picton Street. Mm-hmm. So some were down by the beach, but they were up on the top there. And part of the agreement was that if you came as a Fencible soldier with your family, you had to serve for 7 years, but you also were given an allotment of land. And this was the great attraction. So more than half of the Fencibles came from Ireland. They were Irish Catholics coming out of the poverty of, 19th century Ireland. So the prospect of having a little land, even if it was an acre or a little more, was very appealing. So, sort of market gardens, they looked for work as well. And that's, now the other thing about Howick is in terms of the Stockade Hill. So as you drive into Howick and you see that wonderful vista as you're coming in, Stockade Hill was also created right from the start as an area of safety where the families and children could be clustered together if there was some difficulty in terms of Pākehā Māori relationships. So we're very fortunate that Stockade Hill has been preserved. If you wander up the top, you can see the sort of the earthworks there that go back to the 1860s. That's a long answer, Brian. Is that helpful?
Yes, I just wonder, most people settling in a new area settle where they land at the beach so that they've got access to fish and everything straight away, because usually when they land, they've got no other food, only the fish.
Right. Well, I mentioned about the Maori were very good at trading, in terms of kuruma and potatoes and other bits and pieces. So, and the fish, as you say, they would have been keen to get as much as they could from even the shallow shores of Howick Beach.
Good. Thank you.
Can you tell me what's the history of the Howick name?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I haven't got that immediately here, other than Lord Howick, I think, is a British politician or significant person, and that's the name that was chosen, I think probably through Governor Grey as well. So there's links to Howick in Northern England, and I know Moran Cooper, the former mayor of Howick, made a formal visit to Howick in, it's right in the northern part of England, I understand.
Any other questions, folks?
Not at this stage.
Okay.
Okay, well, let me just carry on. It's rather stimulating comments about. It's estimated that about 50% of the Fencibles were unable to read or write. Yeah, as I say, this sort of call to a new land. It's interesting, isn't it, with migrants? My parents were British migrants after World War II to New Zealand, and I remember my parents saying that, you know, their attraction to New Zealand was, you know, good weather, safety, education and prospects for the children and so forth. And I guess for many migrants, whether it was in the 1840s or right now, would be similar, that New Zealand is an attractive, safe place, educational opportunities and so forth. So for the Fencibles, it was that aspiring nature. They were coming from one side of the world to the other in this arduous 4.5-month voyage, with the prospect of a better future. And if you visit the Howick Historical Village, you'll see some of the genuine first cottages that were built in the late 1840s, early 1850s, where the Fencible families lived in quite, you know, basic conditions that we might look at it today, but they were probably thinking was very good, particularly if you'd come out of the famine-starved Irish situation. I mentioned about, now another little interesting point here. I happen to be a graduate of St John's Theological College in Meadowbank, which is a very old college where Anglicans and Methodists and others trained for Christian ministry. And on the campus there at St John's College in Meadowbank Road are some of the oldest surviving buildings in Auckland. The chapel built in 1847, the kitchen built in 1846, the dining hall built in 1849. And before the first Fencible group came to Howick, before they were landed there on the beach, about 2 weeks before, their welcome to Auckland, their welcome to New Zealand was at St John's College. So they came up the Pruiwa Creek, climbed up the hill to St John's College and had a service with Bishop Selwyn and a feast. And you imagine they'd been on the boat for 4.5 months, came into Waitemata Harbour, and what an experience it must have been, you know, on dry land, climbing up to the college, having their welcome. And when they're at St John's College, they were able to inspect the prefabricated building of All Saints Church that was being built at St John's and was going to be transported out to Howick to be All Saints Anglican Church that is there, you know, on the end of Picton Street today. So that the church was fabricated and prefabricated and there at St John's College, ready for the Fencible families to gather there at Howick. So we are planning later in the year a civic service, a public service at All Saints, probably in the new church, but that older building there on the corner, the oldest building in South Auckland, erected in Howick in 1847, 1848. Very precious that that timber building has actually survived all these years. Now, in terms of the 175th year, I've given you some historical background. In terms of preparing for community commemorations, celebrations, we formed a charitable trust. So myself, Maureen Cooper, Alan LaRoche and Jim Donald, and we formed a working committee with a number of prominent volunteers who bring all sorts of gifts and graces to the table. And we've set up a website. So if you go to, there's my card with our logo that we've already confirmed to. And the website is Howick175, howick175.co.nz. So I'd really encourage you on your laptops, your computers, have a look at the website because it's full of resources, and in particular, look at the calendar of events. So we're challenging organisations, businesses, schools, churches, sometime during this 2022 year to either rename an event or plan a special event that marks something of this 175th anniversary year. And you'll see already there's a rich range of activities. So for example, the Howick Historical Village is already planning a big Easter extravaganza There's a special tea being prepared in little tin sort of cans, if you like, especially for the 175th. There's a specially commissioned beer as well. There's a Howick artist display being planned at Uxbridge. There's a school's mystery history competition. There's a brass band concert being prepared. There's a picnic at St John's College for the public to come and see the 1840s buildings that the early Fencibles would have known. There's a town crier festival planned for later in the year. Now, one of the fortunate things, even in these pandemic times, is that the 175th anniversary, the highlight period is October, November 2022, which I'm personally very grateful for, because if it was next month, we'd probably be in trouble because people are being very precautionary about their health situation. But we are hopeful by later in the year, September, October, and especially November, that we'll be able to have more public gatherings and people will feel more confident about attending an event. We're planning a picnic event at the beach on Saturday, the 12th of November, the unveiling of a plaque at Fencible Walk in Picton Street that day, and also a community luncheon to which the public is invited at the Pakuranga United Rugby Club on the 5th of November. So there'll be many opportunities for the public to be involved, particularly as we head to that key time of October, November, and the calendar of events on the website gives that information of what's there. And most of those events are free to the public as well. So Lee, perhaps if I pause again, maybe there's some comments or questions.
No, you got a quiet group this morning.
That's right. We have appointed a number of ambassadors for the 175th year at our meeting at Bell House on Monday. So 15 people who are influential in a range of organisations, service clubs, churches, schools. So that was very exciting, as they're going to be promoting the resources of the 175th year. So as I say, the calendar of events. Now look, one other matter on the website I'd like to mention is that this facility there for you to tell your story of coming to East Auckland, coming to the Howick area. And this doesn't need to be, you know, stories of your family from the 1840s or 1880s or 1920s. It could be your stories of coming to this area in the 1980s or the 1990s, maybe particularly as a migrant family or a migrant couple. And we'd like to tell those stories. So 250, 300 words, particularly if you've got a photograph to go with it, that relates to sort of Howick and districts. And we're making that appeal. You'll already see a number of stories on the website, but I'm thinking, Lee, you know, your family coming from South Africa in the 1990s, what does it mean to participate and belong to East Auckland? Others coming, Brian and Jenny from the UK, and there'll be others of you too who have stories to tell. You might think about writing that story and the insights that we'd like to hear about. I mentioned about the book resources. So as I say again, Alan LaRoche's book on Gray's Folly is the definitive text. So if you want to know more about Howick and East Auckland history, do get hold of that book and you'll find it a fascinating read. So the website, howick175.co.nz.
Would you be interested in the story of a fourth generation Wellingtonian having to come to Auckland?
Yes. Look, I think any story that you'd like to tell, you'd be very welcome. So you will see on the website, I think, contact the secretary and submit a story, and particularly if you've got a photograph to go with it, that would be good.
Excellent. Is there any sharing now, folk, of your, how long you've been in this area in Howick? Anybody been here?
I'll say something. It was interesting, Richard, to learn that 55% of the new immigrants were Irish. One of the main reasons we left Britain was I got caught in 2 bad explosions caused by the Irish IRA bombs. Windows blowing, nearly me blown up and things like this. You know, we just had enough, you know, got out, you know.
When did you come to New Zealand, Brian?
74.
Yes, well, Leo, you've got a story to tell.
Yeah.
And I think, as I say, that's you know, what, 48 years ago, you're approaching 50 years.
Yeah.
Those sort of more recent stories, particularly the British migrants, but, you know, and then after that, we had waves from, you know, Southeast Asia, South Africa, very important because they make up our remarkably diverse population today.
Yeah, it was frightening, some of the bombs that went off close to me. You know, and I did some stupid things as well. I went to have a look, which was the stupidest thing I could have done, but you know.
Yeah.
Like people going down to the beach to have a look at a tsunami.
Yes, yes, exactly.
I'd just like to comment on the comment you made earlier on about the remoteness of Howick from Auckland when the early settlers arrived. That doesn't just apply to the 1840s, that can also apply to the 1950s, 1960s, because Howick was a long, long way out of Auckland.
Oh, yes.
It's a very good point you make, and that idea of Howick being a long way out, you know, was until recent times. My wife's uncle was here from the 1950s, and he used to drive into the city to work on the concrete road. And I remember him telling me once he remembered, I think it was about 1960 or the early 60s, when he counted 100 cars that were on the way into town from Howick. So there's been big change, and Howick was perceived, you know, as a little country village, seaside village place to go. People went to Bucklands Beach, to the beach, and had a batch. So there's been quite a revolution in the last 40 years of massive development. Even in my, you know, nearly 30 years in East Auckland, you know, most of Botany and Flatbush didn't exist, and that'll be the same, I'm sure, for almost all of you. So we have seen just tremendous growth and change, haven't we?
That's just in 20 years, the time we've been here. We grew, basically spent our early lives in Glen Eden. That was far enough out of Auckland, but at least there was a train connection.
Yes.
So heaven only knows how it was like in 1940s.
Yes, no, you're right. The cemetery and the train there. I used to live in Henderson, so I know that area well. But yeah, it was further. I mean, Howick was still badly served, aren't we, in terms of, you know, no rail link. It's a wee way to the motorway. But on the other hand, it also gives, you know, Howick and surrounding suburbs some distinctive. I was talking to someone the other day and saying that, you know, Auckland's 1.5 million people and pushing out the boundaries, particularly south and north. But there are only a few parts of Greater Auckland that have a sort of a depth of history and identity. And Devonport certainly has it, but I think Howick equally has it. And I think that's because of our geographical position with the Tamaki River and the coastline. It's a defined area, and this special Fencible migration from the 1840s, which is very distinctive. And then you add Alan LaRoche's work, the establishment of the Howick Historical Village, which is now considered probably the leading, you know, village of its kind in New Zealand, portraying, you know, mid-19th century life for Pākehā settlers. So I think that gives Howick and Pakuranga and Botany to some degree a kind of a depth of history and belonging and community spirit that isn't always evident in other parts of Auckland. Now, that's all arguable, of course, but I just sort of throw that out there in terms of why I think Howick has a certain distinctiveness.
Some of you may or may not know, but at Howick Senior Living, that's the rest home where I work, they've named the wards in the hospital section after the ships, the first ships that came in, Minerva, Inchin, Sail, Seymour. So yeah, that we refer to them as communities, not wards, but the various, yeah, and I think that's great that you remember that way.
Lee, was that something done recent, or was that something some time ago?
Some time ago, Richard. Yes.
Right. It's almost like a little story in the paper, Lee, to talk about that and the significance of that. And you see it in some of the street names, Sale Street and so forth, particularly the names around, Old Howick, around the main street, which were linked to the old days.
Yes.
How long has the HBH been operating in that site?
Chris, as far as I know, it's over 70 years. The hospital section at the back is more recent, I would say, in the last 15 years. But I'd have to, I don't know my dates that well, but that is a very vague.
This is Howick Baptist Home beginnings,
Yes.
Lee.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it was about 30 or 40 years ago.
Okay.
Part of, Howick's change and growth.
Correct. Yes.
What a lovely idea, naming the wards, but also naming them as communities rather than a ward.
Yes.
It's lovely.
Yeah, Richard's right there. When I first came back to Auckland in about 1985, Howick Baptist was well established. And that's 30-something years ago.
Yes, I think I've got 1972 on my mind, but I couldn't be precise.
That's quite possible.
Yes.
So in that sense, there's a despite the other thing about Howick, it was a small, seaside village right through until and Pakuranga, a rural area, right through till World War II into the late 40s, only really from the 1950s and that, that significant post-war growth, that a lot more houses, and then the 1960s, Pakuranga really exploded with growth as the sort of major eastern development area like we're sort of seeing in Flatbush today. So there are many older residents who remember when Pakuranga was basically, paddocks and farmland, quite a granary for Auckland, and how it was the little village, by the sea. So that's in the living memory of those who are particularly over 80.
Yes, we can remember that. And that's not too long ago.
Yeah, 1974, that's right.
Yes.
I was told that the trees on Pakuranga Highway were planted there especially so they could be chopped down in case of invasion.
Yes, I think if you read in Alan's book, there might be reference to something of that. I'm not sure it was Pakuranga Road or around the Whitford Bridge or something like that. There were plans put in place in case there was a Japanese invasion and how transport would be impeded. It's a bit terrible, really, isn't it? It's a bit like sort of Russian tanks in Ukraine, isn't it? So just coming back to, I know Brian and Jenny shared, others of you, does anyone go back quite a few years here or, impressions of Howick in earlier times?
Well, I think most of us who are of slightly more advanced years can remember Nappy Valley. When I think the first time I came here would have been in the early 60s. And at that stage, Pakuranga College was out in the middle of the paddocks. There was a farm from there right out to Buckland's Beach. The cows sat in the middle of the road. And then they started building all those, well, in those days, they weren't horrible little houses. Today, I think perhaps they think of them as such. And I drove down Buckland's Beach Road yesterday for the first time in a month and couldn't believe the number of houses that are being bowled and how many horrible little units are being put on those same sections.
Yes, we're seeing another sort of development and intensification, isn't it? That for many of us, it's a foreign, it's not a Kiwi lifestyle, but coming from overseas, terraced housing or 2 or 3 level housing is quite quite the norm. In fact, I'm speaking here from my church office in Botany, and one of our staff members in the church here is from Singapore, and her and her husband have been here just 2 years, and they were saying for the first time they've lived on the ground. And it's been great to be able to walk out from their house that they bought in this area on the ground, because they'd always lived in apartment blocks. And I thought that was, quite interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Interesting.
I've got to leave in about 10 minutes or thereabouts, and I may not be back. There's no reflection on you, Richard. I love your story, and I've
Thank you.
enjoyed the whole thing. I'm sorry I missed it, but at least it's been recorded. Thanks, Lee.
Yeah, thanks, Chris and Claire.
Sure.
I'm still going to be here.
Any other folks with stories about first coming to this area, East Auckland area?
No, just like you, we remember the paddocks and everything. At past Pakuranga town centre, there was nothing much, You got up to the top of the hill and that was it. It was paddocks from there to Howick, we remember all that and the developments that happened out there. Neil Housing got in there and developed all that lot. It's all we've watched it all develop, and there's more and more houses going in everywhere now. It's
well, Brian, they say the collective population of East Auckland, so Old Howick, Pakuranga, Botany, and into Flatbush, is approaching 150,000 people. Similar size to Tauranga, Dunedin, Hamilton. So very sizable community and a very diverse one. The schools, I often say to people, some of the best schools in New Zealand, some of the largest and best churches in New Zealand as well. So a very good area to live. And I think that's why there's a high level of interest in the 175th anniversary, because people want to celebrate our area. And let's be hopeful and prayerful that by the end of the year, we'll be through the worst of the Omicron pandemic, and people will be ready to join in the picnic and the beach, and to be on Stockade Hill, and to attend a range of community events to remember the beginnings of the settlement as we know it today, 175 years ago.
Absolutely.
Yeah, one of the main reasons we moved out to this side of Howick was we were told that the company I was brought here by was going to move to Hamilton. So to go on that side of the city to start off with, and then they'll pay for you to move to Hamilton later on. We never got there. The company was taken over, closed down, and everything else,
Yeah.
When we came here from Wellington in 2000, we were able to get strawberries from someplace in Boston.
That's right. Yes.
Yes. Strawberry fields.
Yes, I remember in the late 90s too, the strawberry picking in sort of Chapel Road, wasn't it, all down that way?
Yeah.
Right.
There's a place called Strawberry Fields out there now, isn't there? They've named an area.
Yeah.
Fortunately, not strawberry fields forever, though.
No.
Well, folk, if nobody else has anything to share, I don't want to cut it short. I'm also just aware of the time. Anybody else? Anything to share? No. Richard, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your knowledge. It's always greatly appreciated. And yes, all the best. See you soon.
Well, thank you, Lee, and folks, thank you for the welcome. And as I say, look at the website, howick175.co.nz, and let's be hopeful about better times later on the year as we celebrate the beginnings of our community.
Absolutely. Thanks, folks. Have a lovely week.
Good.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, folks. Take care.
Thank you.
Yeah.